The sky was dark with the smoke of burning buildings, and the air was thick with the screams of the dying. On the last day of the truce, Sir Archibald Douglas and his Scottish army crossed the Tweed River and razed the English settlement of Tweedmouth. The once peaceful village was now nothing but smoldering ruins, its inhabitants either dead or fleeing for their lives. From the walls of Berwick, King Edward III of England looked on in helpless rage as the Scots hurled meat and bread over the walls to the besieged town, defying his authority. Edward was furious. Not only had the Scots violated the truce, but they had shown no fear of his power. The young king, determined to prove that he was not the weak ruler his father had been, decided to take drastic action. He ordered a tall gallows to be built outside the gates of Berwick, a stark symbol of his resolve. When the structure was complete, he dragged Thomas Seton, the youngest son of the Scottish commander, before the eyes of his father and the Scots. Without hesitation, Edward hanged the young man, a cruel act meant to send a message of terror and retribution. The Scots were shocked. They had underestimated Edward's ruthlessness. Sir William Keith, the new commander of Berwick, sent messengers to negotiate a truce. On July 15th, it was agreed that if the town and castle were not relieved by Vespers on July 19th, they would be handed over to Edward. Keith left Berwick to find Sir Archibald Douglas, who was destroying the area around Morpeth to draw Edward's attention away from the town. The two men decided to meet the English in a full-scale battle. On the morning of July 19th, the Scots began their march toward the English position. Edward's scouts quickly spotted them, and the king arranged his army on Halidon Hill, a strategic location that gave him a significant advantage. The Scots, hoping to terrify the English with their numbers, advanced from the north, but the marshy ground and the steep slope slowed their progress. As they approached, a giant Scottish warrior named Turnbull stepped forward and challenged any Englishman to single combat. Sir Robert Benhale, a knight from Norfolk, answered the challenge and defeated the giant, slicing off his limbs in a display of skill and courage. The battle was about to begin. The Scots charged down the hill, but the marsh and the slope slowed them down. The English archers, positioned at the top, rained arrows down on the advancing Scots, causing chaos and confusion. Edward dismounted and at the forefront of his central battalion, led his men into the fray. The hill became a brutal battleground, with men fighting hand to hand, their faces twisted in rage and fear. The Scots, despite their superior numbers, could not break through the English lines. The English archers continued to rain down arrows, and the Scots began to retreat. Balliol's battalion broke through the enemy lines, forcing the Scots to flee. The Earl of Ross made a final stand, but he too was eventually killed. The battle was a decisive victory for Edward, and the Scots paid a heavy price for their defiance. The Scottish dead were counted in the thousands, and the Earls of Carrick, Ross, Lennox, and Menteith lay among the fallen. The next day, Edward ordered the beheading of 100 captured Scotsmen, ensuring that no one would forget the cost of challenging the King of England. Berwick, once a thriving town, was now a smoking ruin, its walls and buildings destroyed by Edward's siege engines. The victory at Halidon Hill proved that Edward was a formidable leader, capable of leading his men to victory against overwhelming odds. The English people rejoiced, and the king's reputation as a warrior of God was cemented. Edward had shown that he was not only a king, but a leader chosen by God to carry out his will. Edward III, the young King of England, was a man of deep faith and royal splendor. His religious objects were not just symbols of his status, but also a reflection of his spiritual life. The keeper of his wardrobe in late 1332 recorded an impressive collection of religious artifacts. Among these was a beautiful gilded silver crystal reliquary vase, adorned with precious stones and topped by a silver image of the crucifixion. He also owned 2 gilded silver basins with images of Christ, and a variety of ecclesiastical items like bowls, chalices, and candelabra. Edward's library was filled with religious books, including choral books, missals, and gospels, some of which were richly illustrated with silver and gold images. One of the most striking items in his collection was a ceremonial cope worn by his priests, which featured detailed depictions of saints and their martyrdoms. These images included St. Thomas, St. Lawrence, St. Denis, St. Blasius, St. Edmund, St. Stephen, and the beheading of St. John the Baptist, all crafted in gold and silver. These images not only showcased Edward's appreciation for the saints, but also his fascination with the idea of physical suffering as a path to redemption. a theme that was central to the Crusader ethos. Edward's relic collection was equally impressive. He inherited a vast array of relics from his parents, including a thorn from the crown of thorns and a fragment of the true cross, known as the Neath Cross. These relics were kept safely at the Tower of London, a symbol of his deep devotion and the spiritual heritage of his family. Despite the grandeur of his religious possessions, it's challenging to gauge Edward's personal faith. Most of the evidence we have is about his public displays of religion, which could be both religious and political in nature. For example, his ruthlessness in punishing enemies, such as hanging Thomas Seton at Berwick and massacring 100 after the Battle of Halidon Hill, might seem at odds with a deep spiritual life. However, it's important to remember that in Edward's time, punishing rebels was often seen as a way to enforce God's law. Edward was capable of mercy, as shown by his forgiveness of Mortimer's supporters and the Cheapside workmen after his queen, Philippa, pleaded for their lives. There are, however, signs that Edward had a strong spiritual foundation even in his youth. He often gave away his personal possessions but never his relics, suggesting a deep respect for religious artifacts. His devotion to certain saints like St. George, St. Thomas the Martyr, and the Virgin Mary was lifelong. He made regular pilgrimages to the shrine of St. Thomas at Canterbury, and frequently visited statues of the Virgin Mary, even going out of his way to do so. This devotion went beyond routine and propaganda, indicating a genuine and lasting faith. Edward's combination of war and spirituality was also significant. He was deeply interested in the Crusades and saw himself as a soldier of God. His choice of St. George as his patron saint was not just a political move, but a spiritual one. He even designed his tournament armor to reflect this, often wearing white with a red cross, symbolizing his role as St. George's champion. This commitment to his faith influenced his leadership, diplomacy, and military actions, all of which he believed were divinely sanctioned. In 1333, Edward celebrated Christmas at Wallingford Castle with a lavish feast. The court was in high spirits, and Edward rewarded his loyal followers, such as William Montagu, with significant gifts. He also received news that his father, Edward II, was under papal protection, which reassured him that there was no threat to his kingship. Edward's family life was also improving. He had forgiven his mother, Isabella, for her past actions and even supported her with a higher income. Philippa, his wife, was also supportive of Isabella, and the papal curia acknowledged her help in discrediting rumors about Isabella's affair with Mortimer. The birth of more children brought new possibilities for alliances. Edward planned to marry his daughter Isabella to the heir of Castile and his brother John to Mary, the daughter of the Lord of Coucy. His son, Edward, and his newborn daughter, Joan, were also considered for future marriages, though the political tensions with France put some of these plans on hold. The court's exuberance was evident in the elaborate tournaments and games that followed the victory at Halidon Hill. The costumes and armor commissioned for these events were incredibly detailed and expensive. For example, in March 1334, Edward ordered a variety of richly decorated surcoats, hoods, and suits for himself and his courtiers. These included surcoats with intricate embroidery, suits of armor with magnificent designs, and even a bed made of silk with gold and jasper decorations. The cost and effort put into these items were extraordinary, reflecting Edward's desire to showcase his wealth and power. The extravagant displays of the court were not just about showing off. They were a way for Edward to reinforce his authority and the divine right of his rule. The unbounded extravagance of these displays, often overlooked by historians, played a significant role in the royal finances, contributing to Edward's mounting debts. Despite this, the splendor of the court was a testament to Edward's vision and his determination to rule with both strength and grace. Edward III, the young King of England, was a man of many passions, and one of them was chivalry. He loved tournaments where knights would joust and show off their bravery and skill. For the tournament at Dunstable in January 1334, Edward didn't just prepare himself, he prepared a grand spectacle. He ordered 3 horse harnesses for his tournament armor, each adorned with pennons, flags, and standards. He also had 2 great suits of armor made, one of which was for the joust and was embroidered with the arms of Lionel, a knight from the Arthurian legend. This wasn't just a nod to a hero, it was a deeper reference to Lionel and his brother, Sir Bors, who had grown up under the rule of an interloper, much like Edward had grown up under the influence of Mortimer. The Dunstable tournament was a grand event, with 135 knights and esquires taking part. Edward made sure they were all dressed to impress. He had a team of armorers, including both local craftsmen and foreign experts, working tirelessly to create the finest armor. These armorers, like Thomas Copham, William Standerwick, John of Cologne, and Gerard of Tournai, were responsible for producing a wide range of equipment, from burnished helmets to complete suits of jousting armor. One particularly interesting piece was a plate corset lined in white silk, one for the king and another for his trusted knight, William Montagu. This was an early example of the breastplate, which would become more common in the years to come. Edward's love for chivalry and grand displays extended to his daily life. He had so many outfits that it's hard to imagine him wearing any one item more than once, except perhaps his golden and gem-encrusted eagle crest. He was always looking for new ways to outdo himself and his knights. For one tournament, he ordered 2 surcoats, one for himself and one for Sir William Montagu, both decorated with birds and song lyrics. He wanted to create a strong bond with his knights, and one way he did this was by dressing them in the same livery as himself. He even included his young son, the future king, in these displays. By the age of 4, the little prince had his own horse, and by 7, his own suit of armor, making it clear that he was part of the elite military group at court. But Edward's world wasn't just about tournaments and grand displays. He faced real challenges, especially in Scotland. After his victory at Halidon Hill, he thought Scotland would fall easily, but he was wrong. The Scottish people were fiercely patriotic, and even though most of the country was under his control, a few castles still held out. Edward let Balliol, his puppet king in Scotland, handle the resistance, but Balliol lacked the resources to keep the rebels in check. The situation worsened when King David II and his wife, Queen Joan, fled to France, solidifying the alliance between Scotland and France against Edward. In 1334, Edward's focus shifted from chivalric displays to military strategy. He summoned Parliament to raise funds for a new expedition to Scotland. Despite the harsh winter and the difficult conditions, he was determined to put down the rebellion. He assembled a large army, including a significant number of archers, which was a new and innovative approach. Archers were crucial in his previous victories, and he believed they would be key to success in Scotland. The winter of 1334 was one of the harshest on record. Frost, snow, and hail lasted for 4 months, making it nearly impossible to campaign. Edward's army faced freezing conditions, and many men had to return home to their farms. Edward tried to relieve the besieged castle of Dundalk, but the Scots avoided direct confrontation, knowing that the English army would eventually have to withdraw. As the winter wore on, Edward's army dwindled, and he realized he had no choice but to retreat. Despite the setback, Edward remained undeterred. He continued to demand reinforcements, and ordered a naval blockade to cut off supplies to the Scottish rebels. His determination was clear, but the challenges of the Scottish campaign were far from over. Edward's journey as a king was just beginning, and he would face many more trials in his quest to assert his authority over Scotland and maintain his position as a powerful ruler. Edward was learning that war wasn't just about the glory and excitement he had imagined as a teenager. It was a long, hard grind full of strategy and diplomacy. Supply lines were as important as bravery on the battlefield, and leadership meant more than just leading troops to victory. The French were now pressuring Edward to negotiate with the Scots, and without the resources for a new offensive, he had to listen. In March, French and papal envoys arrived, and Edward agreed to a truce until the summer. He even allowed 4 Scottish partisans to attend Parliament to present their case, as the French had requested. Money was becoming a big concern for Edward. He knew that failing to pay his soldiers would weaken his army and make it harder to raise new forces. To keep fighting, he needed more money from taxes, which Parliament had to approve. At the Parliament in York in May 1335, Edward started to focus on economic reforms. He passed the Statute of York, which allowed foreign merchants to trade freely in England. This surprised and upset the Londoners, who had previously been granted control over their own trade. But Edward was determined, and only reversed this policy a few years later when it suited him. Edward also passed the Statute of Money, which aimed to stop gold and silver from leaving the country. Money was flowing out because of a trade imbalance, but people thought it was due to hoarding and taking silver abroad. To prevent this, pilgrims were restricted to using Dover as their only port, and there were searches for money and restrictions on melting down coins. Although it wasn't the perfect solution, it showed that Edward was trying to address the problem. Despite these economic concerns, Edward's main focus remained the war in Scotland. He told the French and Scottish envoys that as soon as the truce ended, he would launch another attack. He issued orders for the next campaign just days after leaving Roxburgh. When Frenchmen led by a Scotsman attacked an English ship, Edward had even more reason to renew his campaign. He ordered Ireland to prepare a siege engine and raised more troops. By June, he was ready to fight again. The army was set to gather at Newcastle on June 23, 1335. This time, Edward had a foreign ally, Count William of Juliers, who was married to Edward's sister. From the shires, a large contingent of archers was ordered, bringing the total army to over 13,000. Balliol joined Edward, and together they planned to split into two armies. Edward led one, and Balliol led the other. They were joined by several powerful earls, and the contrast with Edward's father, who rarely had more than 2 or 3 earls join his campaigns, was clear. The Scottish people would have seen this as a display of English military strength. Leading his men, Edward felt at home. He could forget about his money troubles and ecclesiastical advisors and focus on his favorite role, commander. He rewarded his friends, like Sir William Montagu, with gifts and honors. But the campaign was brutal. Knights were dubbed, prayers were said, and then the destruction began. Towns were looted, people were killed, and even monasteries were attacked. Edward's goal was to show his power and strike fear into the hearts of the Scottish people. In August 1335, the situation escalated. The French Parliament declared support for the Scots with 6,000 troops, including 1,000 men at arms. Philip of France invited Edward to submit his quarrel with David II to arbitration. But Edward ignored this. Robert of Namur, a nephew of Edward's cousin, was captured by the Scots and released after swearing not to fight in Scotland. Edward, aware of the French threat, took steps to defend his kingdom. He ordered men to represent him in London, prepared the Londoners for an invasion, and sent his infant son to Nottingham Castle for safety. He divided the kingdom into 3 parts and ordered local leaders to defend each. England and Wales braced for a French invasion. The conflict between Edward and Philip was now inevitable. Both were proud medieval kings, and neither was willing to back down. Edward had a legal claim to parts of France, giving him an advantage. French raids on English coastal towns increased Edward's ability to raise money for war. When Philip's letter of support for the Scots finally arrived, Edward replied that he would quickly pacify Scotland, and that Philip had no right to interfere. The Pope was also urging Philip to back down, but the capture of the Earl of Moray by the garrison of Roxburgh weakened the Scots' position. Key Scottish leaders surrendered, and Edward's Irish invasion force attacked Ruthless Castle, though without success. Edward's message was clear. He could bring multiple armies to bear on Scotland from different directions. In September, Edward returned to the Scottish lowlands. He was determined to secure Edinburgh as a stronghold, along with Roxburgh and Berwick. This would strengthen his control of the border. However, the garrisons he left were small, and John Stirling, the commander of Edinburgh, realized they might not be enough to hold the fortresses. It wasn't until 1337 that Edward acknowledged Stirling's concerns. Edward's strategy in Scotland, constant pressure, and large-scale expeditions was working. The long breaks between battles allowed his men to return home, and him to raise more money. He stayed on the border through the winter to show his readiness to fight. The war, he made clear, was far from over. Unless a permanent peace could be arranged on his terms, he would raise another army the following year, and the next and the next. Edward III's life was filled with decisions and conflicts, especially when it came to his dealings with Scotland and France. His pride and strategic thinking often kept him from making peace, even when the Scots or French asked for a truce. In late 1335, both Philip of France and the Pope were eager for a lasting peace, hoping to ensure a successful crusade. They sent negotiators to Edward, but he was in no rush to agree. It wasn't until January 1336, that a compromise was even considered. Edward extended his truce with Scotland and demanded that the Scots, led by Sir Andrew Murray, stop sieging two castles. He also insisted that Edward Balliol would rule Scotland for his lifetime, with David II as his heir. However, David II, still a young boy in France, refused to agree to any terms. This refusal shocked Edward and the other negotiators, setting the stage for further conflict. In April 1336, Edward dined on his ship, the Christopher, moored near the Tower of London. This was a time of intense planning and secrecy. Edward then visited Waltham Abbey, where he granted requests for chantries to pray for his father's soul. His movements and decisions seemed strange, especially considering the approaching end of the truce with Scotland. During this time, Nicolanus Fieschi, a relative of the author of the Fieschi letter, arrived and became a trusted advisor. This letter, which revealed the location of Edward's father, Edward II in northern Italy, was a significant piece of information that Edward had to keep secret. He took steps to address the issues surrounding his father's disappearance, including clearing Lord Berkeley of the murder charges and founding King's Hall at Cambridge University. By mid-May 1336, Edward was ready for another campaign in Scotland. He moved quickly, reaching Durham by June 10th. His speed was driven not only by a desire to catch up with his army, but also by the growing threat from France. Philip of France had decided to support the Scots with a French army, and Edward took drastic measures to destroy any potential landing sites. He ordered the destruction of food supplies, cattle, and towns, personally overseeing the burning of Aberdeen. Despite the ruthlessness, Edward's actions were strategic, aimed at weakening the Scots and French. While Edward was in Scotland, a great council was held at Northampton to discuss the escalating conflict with France. The council decided to send another embassy to seek a compromise, but Philip was determined to go to war. The French fleet began attacking English ships, and English merchants in Ghent and Bruges were rounded up. The situation worsened when Edward received news of his brother, John of Eltham's, sudden death. John, only 20 years old, had been a close companion to Edward, and his loss was deeply felt. Edward ordered 900 masses to be said for John's soul, and continued to be affected by his death for years. Edward's grief and the growing threat from France led to a rushed return to Nottingham, where he convened another council. The council granted Edward the necessary taxes and resources to prepare for invasion. The Scots, emboldened by French support, began destroying their own lands to prevent the English from using them. Edward's response was to raise an immense defensive army and secure funds from Italian banking houses. He also sought naval support from Bayonne and requested the King of Norway's assistance. In this tense and challenging period, Edward III faced the daunting task of defending his kingdom against multiple enemies. His actions, though sometimes ruthless, were driven by a deep sense of duty and a desire to protect his people. Despite the losses and the mounting pressures, Edward remained resolute, preparing for the battles that lay ahead.